transplanted sense of community. And so within this space, what I argue in the book, and this really came through many discussions with Ruth, is that the notion of identity began to shift and to what I call the intentionally hyphenated Cuban-Jewish identity, and that this linking of the Cuban and the Jewish in this kind of new way took place within Miami in a way that was quite different from the sense of Jewishness in Cuba. So by 1968, the Sephardim had branched off from the Círculo to form the Cuban Sephardic Hebrew congregation, which was reminiscent of Shevet Achim, which you had seen photos of, which was the Sephardic synagogue in Havana. And throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, you have the Círculo and the Cuban Sephardic Hebrew congregation, which are organizing social events. You have women's committees. A lot of the same committees that you saw in Margalite's slides are represented in these two congregations that are developing here in Miami Beach. And congregation members volunteered in local hospitals and yeshivas, actively campaigned for the Israel Bonds Drive and initiated Sunday schools. They even had Queen Esther beauty pageants and debutante dances. They had balnearios, beach club days every summer. Here's a photo of one of the balnearios at a Miami Beach hotel. And they started out with small storefront offices, which functioned as creative and economical alternatives to traditional synagogues. But by the mid-1960s, this hyphenated Cuban Jewish identity became the foundation for their involvement in South Florida's Jewish community. And so you see a marked shift by the late 1960s, where the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for example, in 1966, forms its Cuba division. And for the first time, the Cuban Jewish community is beginning to feel accepted by the American co-religionists. I have some really powerful quotes from folks that I interviewed in the where they described in the early 1960s, having these encounters in grocery stores or drugstores with American Jews who really looked at them, in the words of one person, as lepers. And so you see this shift happening in the late 60s, early 70s, and by the early 1970s, the Círculo comes out with a publication which is just so classic. It's just quintessentially Juban, which is El Nuevo Juban, right? and so again, kind of the redefining of identity. And they spelled it Jewban, which is very interesting. And Ruth has written about the definition of Jubanidad, right, of Jubanness, and has spelled it Juban. And I think these different articulations really have come to kind of define what the identity became in Miami. In 1976, the Círculo constructed the first Cuban synagogue in Miami, the Cuban Hebrew Congregation of Miami. And you see that at the top here. And that's located on 17th Street in South Beach. But even today, I'm sure many people in the room will agree that it's still referred to as El Círculo. It might be the Cuban Hebrew congregation, but it has these roots. And by 1980, the Cuban Sephardic Hebrew congregation opened the first Sephardic synagogue, Temple Moses, on Normandy Isle in Miami Beach, and that's the second photo you see here. And as the years passed, the Cuban Hebrew congregation shifted from orthodoxy towards conservatism, but Temple Moses has retained its traditional or halakhic ideology. So the mid-1960s witnessed a heightened call from groups of young, often second-generation Cuban Americans for the normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba. After in 1978, after President Jimmy Carter met secretly with Cuban officials in New York and Havana and to discuss a human rights agenda, Fidel Castro invited emigres to Cuba to participate in what has become known as the Diálogo, regarding the possibility of releasing 3,000 political prisoners and permitting travel back and forth for family reunification purposes. Well, the diálogo question hit the Cuban Jewish community quite hard here in Miami because Bernardo Benes, a prominent member of the community, was one of the 75 people who was chosen to participate in this. So the hardline Cuban exile community flipped out about the diálogo in general, and Bernardo was the focus of many of their attacks. They protested at his bank where he worked. He received numerous death threats. And in May of 1983, militant extremists bombed Miami's Continental Bank, of which Benes was a president. And so although the Cuban Jewish community had always avoided political issues, in the aftermath of the diálogo, which saw the arrival in the United States of 3,600 political prisoners from Cuban jails and an easing of travel restrictions, the controversy was now directly in the backyard of the Cuban Jewish community. And the Jubans were again brought into the spotlight when Benes took Rabbi Abramovitz to Cuba to meet with the remaining Jewish community there and perform Jewish rituals. And many within the community also were quite opposed to this travel, reflective of Ruth's father, very opposed to any travel, any dialogue with the island and with the Castro regime. So, and I want to just shift for a moment now to 1980 and 1981, when, of course, we had the Mariel boat lift, 125,000 Cubans arriving in Miami as part of that. And beginning in April of 1980, of course, the Castro regime came up with the policy that you could come and pick up your relatives at the port of Mariel, but you had to also transport Cuba's so-called undesirables, the mentally ill, homosexuals, and people who were in Cuba's jails. And so, although these undesirables, so-called, comprised a small percentage of Marielitos, of course, they received an abundance of media attention. Well, this was important for the Jewish community because there were approximately 400 Jews who came with this group of Marielitos, 125,000. And that was a significant number considering at the time only 807 observant Jews remained on the island by one count. So, but Mariel did not impact the community, of course, here in Miami, much as it did it didn't affect the Cuban Jewish community in the same way it did the larger Cuban exile community because of this small number. It was ironic, though, that the principal organization that provided assistance to the Jewish Marielitos was the Resettlement Task Force of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. So the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, which had initially not received the Cuban Jews warmly, was now the group that was receiving them, and as many people from the community described to me, the Cuban Jewish community, which was now quite established in Miami, kept a gentle distance from the Marielito Jews who had come over. They were perceived as being sympathetic to Castro and to communism. One woman told me, she's a Marielita, she said, "I was mentioned within the community as a possible communist when I was arriving here, the moment that I arrived. The 1960s emigres mentioned to me, you know, are you a communist because you came late?" But she emphasized that once she denounced communism and the Castro government and gave, in her words, valid reasons for staying in Cuba, in communist Cuba, that she was embraced by the community. And so I talk in the book about this shift in generations between the original generation and then the Marielitos, and then I talk about also the generation from the 1990s that came over under quite different circumstances after all of the openings that we heard about. So while the Cuban community has enjoyed improved relations with the American Jewish community over the past 2 decades, it has also sought to really retain this Cuban Jewish character and build community solidarity through religious and social events. This is the photo of the 3 flags that you see. You see this reflected in both synagogues today. And this is a very common image where you see the linking up of the flags as a symbol of this kind of 2 or 3-part identity. And as I was saying, you have these religious and social events that evoke the Cuban heritage and the Cuban heritage of this community. You have Noche Cubana, Canasta Cubana, you have lots of things Cubana, and I'd actually be interested to know in our discussion from members of the community whether you see this, this continuing to happen, if this is changing. These are photos, I think, from a bulletin from Temple Moses from the mid-90s. So the community struggles, I think, to retain its Cubanidad, and indeed its Jubanidad, in the face of more than 40 years of exile, and actually, that's when I wrote this, now 50, right? Second generation Cuban exiles have a very different relationship with Cuba than do their parents, and I talk in the book about the relationship of that second generation with Cuba, that they know Cuba really through their contact with Cubans in Miami, their synagogue's emphasis on celebrating Cuban Jewish identity, and most importantly, as Ruth described so poignantly, through their parents' and grandparents' stories and photographs. Those are the connections that they have to Cuba. Most of the people around my age that I spoke with, they're rooted mostly in an American Jewish identity, and Cuba is really something that represents family history and kind of, a cool, interesting, something different about them, but not something that's a part of their daily identity in the way that you see in these bulletins and other community documents. So I want to return to this one quote of Aaron Kelton again, who just said to me, as he was talking about his own identity again, he came over in the early 60s, he said, I love Cuba, Cuba was good to me and my parents, I love the United States, I'm almost half Yankee now, and I love Israel. And so again, talking about kind of navigating across those boundaries and both geographic and temporal is quite a focus of the community. And so I'll just end now with, where I ended the book was in the 1990s, and many folks, again, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, spoke about the Cuban Jewish community in very stark terms to me. I kept hearing words like extinction of the community, and so I want to give you a couple quotes that folks related to me, and then talk about just some of the places that I was interested in going with the research, and perhaps that could be a point of departure for our conversation. So without the presence of this older generation, many of the younger generation thought the community only had a slim chance of surviving. That was another quote. While many young Cuban Jews in South Florida are involved in Jewish groups, they're not run by the Cuban synagogues necessarily. And so I had a 19-year-old who worked for the Israeli consulate, was very involved in Jewish life outside his synagogue. His synagogue was Temple Moses. And he sent me an email message at one point where he said the following words. He said, Temple Moses is slowly dying, although the membership hasn't dropped off and high holiday services are still packed. There are hardly any people showing up on Saturdays. It's really sad. Another Cuban Jewish individual who was associated with the Cuban Hebrew congregation used a culinary metaphor to convey the younger generation's shift in identity. He said the Cuban Jewish community really is dying because people who identified themselves as Cuban Jews are getting older. The generation is in their 40s and 50s now. The children and grandchildren are apple pie, not flan. But to end on a more positive note, I want to invoke the words of a 20-year-old Ashkenazi Juban who I interviewed, who I think gave perhaps a clearer definition of kind of where he was at and is reflective of others. It's quite nuanced. He says, I think all the Cuban Jewish families are the same. I think that's why the kids get along so well, because we've all been through the same things. We've experienced the same things. All of our parents are very similar. I think that's why we've kept this group going. But I definitely think that the kind of bond that my parents' generation had is one of a kind. I don't think it'll ever be like that again. They were all born in Cuba. My grandparents weren't. So even my grandparents' group of friends, they didn't have a group of friends that were all Cuban. My parents and their friends, they're all Cuban. They have these incredible bonds. As time goes by, that part will fade more and more. I'm meeting all of my American friends, assimilating to what's going on now. I think they needed to have that bond when they first came to this country because they were alone, they were strangers, they relied upon each other. And now we don't need it as much. We're established, we're part of the Miami Jewish community. We don't need to stick together as much. But when I asked him about that doom and gloom scenario that others had said to me, he his eyebrows shot up. He said, "Oh, no, 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 no." And he said, I even related to him his father's prediction, his father having come over as a young child, that perhaps the synagogue might do away with the name Cuban Hebrew Congregation and replace it with something that sounded more American. He said, "Oh, no, no, no. I think things like the name need to stay and will stay. I wouldn't even think about changing it." I'm surprised to hear about that, and he wants to have a whole conversation with his dad afterwards. He says, regardless of who I marry, I mean, I'm Cuban Jewish. That's the Jewish Cuban congregation. And if you're going to be part of that congregation, you don't need to be Jewish Cuban, but you're going to go in there, you're not going to go in there and change its name. And he says, people that come to our country, they will become part of our country. They influence it, they change it, but we're still America. It's not going to be something different. The traditions and undertones should always stay the same. As far as everyday living, I think those things will change more. But the names should stay the same, he says. What it means and what it's about in a current sense will change. So I think the notion of kind of past, present, and future is very fluid, and you have this very unique set of historical circumstances which created a community that had a double diaspora and has now created a home in Miami. So while there's no consensus about the future of the community, I think these narratives reveal a widespread expectation that Miami's Cuban Jewish community will undergo a significant reconfiguration in the coming years, and I'd love in the conversation to talk about how that might take shape. So thank you.
Good morning still. Thank you for coming. When Professor Duani asked me to participate in this event, I gladly said so. And I changed a trip that was scheduled to be in the Dominican Republic this weekend to teach, because I thought this was very important to be here. I want to thank profusely from my heart the work for the last over 20 years that Marguerite and Ruth and Carrie have been doing in the Jewish community. Sometimes I wonder how come, after all, there were only 15,000 Jews, 12 from Havana and 3 throughout the island, as I've always been reading and talking with different people. How come there are so many people interested in that island and in the Jewish community, which is interesting that I am not a researcher. Basically, I do teach at FIU. I'm proud to be part of the staff. In January, I'll be celebrating my 35th anniversary of teaching here, even though most people know me as a banker. That's what I did during the daytime, and twice a week I was here. I always keep saying I should have been 2 more days a week in the gym trying to take care of myself. But I'll tell you, whatever they've written is very accurate. I've been fortunate. God gave me the opportunity to have experienced most of the things that they've said, especially starting since I was born in 1946, right after the end of the war. And I lived in the town of Guanabacoa. For those of you who are not familiar with Cuba, Guanabacoa is to Havana what Hialeah is to Miami. right? It is the industrial city. It's a city that had a lot of the Jewish factories. What I mentioned about the shoe factories, there were clothing stores. We had Chinese in Guanabacoa, we had Spaniards, we had the Jews, we had Lebanese, we had Syrians, and we had Santeros. Okay, so all these things that they have referred to, I live with them. My parents had a clothing store. All these people came through that store, especially the Santeros and the Babalaos, and all that. We sold a lot of, my parents sold a lot of the white clothing that they wear. In any case, I just want to tell you this, that as a child, right around the block from my house, there was a corner. And the corner was still known, as far as I know, as las calles, or the streets, Amarguras and Desamparados. I would ride that street every day, riding the bicycle I take in from school. I first started going to a school half a block away called Colegio Lancha. And then as I was getting into third grade, my mother decided that I needed to have a Jewish education. So she started making the efforts with another group of mothers to get a bus to go from the area known as Santo Suarez or La Víbora into Guanabacoa, which is only about 10 kilometers. But it looked like the end of the world. And there was no, there were financials there, even though I think the bus at the time was about $5 a month or something. A lot of the families couldn't afford it. So finally she was able to get up 12 families, and the bus was finally approved after several meetings of the women's committee or the parents committee of the school to send this bus. And I was one of them. The bus found more kids, so by the time we got to school, it was 30 something kids. Now, the interesting is that how many of you would send today a child to a school, spend 5 hours a day, 4 trips, 1.25 hours to get an education? We did that. I did it from 3rd to about 6th grade, and others continue on to high school. That's what it took. But I'll tell you this, we had an excellent education. We had the Centro Israelita, and there was another school called Albert Einstein that existed. There were top schools. The Centro Israelita had half a day was in the taught Yiddish with a little bit of Hebrew. We learned 10 words in Hebrew. And then we had the whole curriculum, and half of the day in Spanish, and within that we had a little bit of English. But all of us that came through these schools were able to come into mainstream America, into our educational system as we arrived, rather quickly, even though we lacked really knowledge of English, especially the speaking part. I'd like to tell you that as I was growing up, I'd known I have not returned because the source of returning to Cuba is a source of marital conflict within my family. I have tried it from every way, and I hope one day that FIU, as we get involved more with the Cuban situation, and things change, I'm able to go officially as an FIU individual, so that way my wife cannot complain. But it's interesting that this is a source of problem among many families. Not too long ago, my sister-in-law, my wife and her about 8 years apart, she left Cuba when she was 3 years old. She was all excited about going to Cuba. So I said, guess what? You need a guide, so I remember well, I'm going to go with you. Because knowing that then my wife will not complain. So as we were getting ready to do all the reparations on that and make the contacts and everything else, we sat at a dinner table, the Shabbat table, with my brother-in-law, who is an American, an attorney, and very focused on things. And he said, tell me, how much is it going to cost to go to Cuba for a week? He says, well, right now it's about $3,100 a person. I said, what? $3,100 a person. When I got 2 daughters going to Duke University and 1 son going to private school, you know how much billable time I got to come up with in order to be able to go that? So he says, we can wait. Right now, we cannot do it. So the whole thing went down the drain. In any case, I want to tell you, during the years that I was growing up, I was a happy kid. I was going from Guanabacoa to the Jewish school in Santo Suarez, then I would go on Sundays, I would go to the Patronato, and my bar mitzvah was in Old Havana, so it's still there. And we used to have, remember, I saw the big picture of Moshe Pipik, my bar mitzvah party was a Moshe Pipik. So, and then as I did the bar mitzvah, we had a club called the Bar Mitzvah Club. Right? She talked about the separation between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi. But at the Bar Mitzvah Club, on Sunday mornings, where both boys and girls came, and also Ashkenazi and Sephardic, that's where I met Luis Segosi, right? We all got together, and we joked, because then at that point was really a joke, the part between being Polaco, being Turco. So right? Which continue on to this day here. We had a wonderful growing up, and I'll tell you, this whole change of 1959, we started feeling. The community at first was very pro the new change in Cuba, not knowing what was happening. I remember some of the very distinct conversations. I remember one of them in Miramar. They had put, one of the very excited younger members put a sign in his house, Fidel, esta es tu casa. Fidel, this is your house. And this older fellow who migrated to Cuba says, watch it, that house is going to be his. He's going to take it away. Okay? Lo and behold, a few months later, they were in Miami. Okay? I remember Bay of Pigs. I was in Cuba in Bay of Pigs. And I remember that day, the day before, my uncle called my mother and said, I need some help at the store. And would you send Marcos over? It's about 13, 14. So I get up in the morning, I go from Guanabacoa to Buenavista, which is about another 12 kilometers more or less. Go 2 buses, and I get there about 8 o'clock in the morning. Deserted the streets. So I walk, my uncle had not arrived. One of the neighbors, who was a competitor of my uncle, but was a friend of my mother from their teenage years, opens the store and says, Marcus, what are you walking on the street? Don't you know what just happened? I said, what just happened? I don't know. They just bombarded the air base down a kilometer away. Get in here. So she put it to me in her store, and until my uncle arrived, a couple of doors down. And then one thing interesting I saw, anybody that looked happy that day was put on a bus and taken to the theater, the Rosita de Ornedo, the Blanquita Theater, and it was basically put in jail there during the duration of the invasion. So it was 3 or 4 days, people were, it was horrible. And I watched out because I did not stay at home during those days. I stayed with my uncles in his house. Then, every Sunday, as we were coming to the Patronato, everybody was saying, I'm leaving next week, and I'm leaving next week, and I'm leaving next week. And all of a sudden, I see that 2 cousins of mine come Sunday and says, we're leaving on the 15th, on the 12th of April, whatever it was. I said, what? Where are you going? Oh, we're going to Miami. I said, how? The relations have been broken. And he says, how did you get the visa? How did you get the passport? The passport you could get. How did you get the visa? I knew they didn't have a visa before. All was a whole secrecy. So I came home, and I told my parents. They called the grandmother. She says, I don't know anything what's going on. It was so secret, this whole thing, that even within close family members, you don't talk about it. So I said, I'm going to find out. So I called their father, who was my godfather, and I said, what's going on? How are they leaving? So he says, okay, you want to go? Yes, I want to go. So we made the arrangements. There was one individual who was a contact to Hias, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society in Cuba, who had a store not too far from him, from his wholesale place. And when the store closed at lunchtime for the 2 hours, he would see us, and he would take all the information and then transmit it to New York. And then we got what was known as the visa waiver, because there were no relations, so you cannot get an official visa. So you've heard about the Operation Pedro Pan, right? 14,048 kids came. I have never seen the exact list, I have never seen the names. I mean, I know some of the people because I'm currently a trustee of the Operation Pedro Pan organization. However, I was one of the 396 Jewish kids that came on that operation. In proportion to population, the Jewish Pedro Pans was higher than the rest of the population. If you make the count that there were 396 kids to 12,000 or 15,000 Jews, to the rest of the 14,000 to the 6 million population that Cuba had at the time. I was sent to Los Angeles to foster homes. There I learned religion. I was sent to an Orthodox foster home. And when I thought that the religious one in my family was my grandmother. Because even though my parents were kosher and everything else, because they were in the retail business, they had no choice but to work on Saturday. But my grandmother stayed very, very calm that day. I get to this home, and I find out that they want me to go to temple every day, every Saturday. They want me to eat kosher, take the sandwiches from the house. I was used to a heavy lunch in Cuba. I'd rather pay 25 cents at the high school and get myself, a nice lunch. All kinds of conflicts. So I always try to be a little bit creative. So I said, now on Saturday came along, I could not shave, I could not shower. I had to walk to shul about 3 miles. I could not open my mail. I could not, had to wait. And that was my only thing. There was no email those days, right? And of course I wouldn't be able to do it either. And I said, I gotta find a way out of this. It's interesting. So I said, wait a minute. The bus, when I come from school, stops right in front of the cinema. I am going to buy the tickets on Friday afternoon and go then Saturday. Not carrying any money, right, which is prohibited on Shabbat. Then they say, well, I came up with a great idea, and they said, no, you cannot do it. Why can't you? Because what are the neighbors going to say? I said, what do you mean, neighbors? The neighbors know me more than they know you. Because I was walking around, trying to meet the people, and they were working and all that. So then, after a while, I started putting pressure to come to Miami to my family that started arriving. Because LA couldn't figure out why I was there. New York, who was controlling the whole situation, said, okay, if they can find him in Miami, it's okay with us. There were even friends, Masonic friends, of my father who were actually claiming to come and live with him. It was apparently a policy decision that had been made in Miami to get as many Cubans out of Miami as possible. And every time the request would come, it would be denied for me to come.